Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Happy Memorial Day to all those who celebrate, and we shout out all the soldiers, whether you have served or not. We are thankful for your service. But today, on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, we have a great show ahead. We will be covering everything from ESPN's tight end rankings and the rookie rankings for the upcoming fantasy football season to the Group of 5 fantasy college football preview. And also, we're going to be looking at the big games in the NBA and NHL tonight as the Pacers face the Celtics and the Oilers face the Stars. But as always, I do ask before we begin that you do like and follow the show. Also, if you would like to leave a tip or a donation, please go to the link shown here at gsmc.cloud. All your support is a big help to the network. It helps me and my fellow podcasters, so it is greatly appreciated if you do decide to leave a tip or donation. Also, you can leave a question for me to be answered at the beginning of the next episode, so do please make yourself available to that link right there. Now, to start off the show, we are going to be talking about the Pacers and the Celtics. Sorry about that. That should say Game 4 betting preview. But ultimately, this is going to be a very interesting game, as the big thing that I think about when I think about this series is the word luck. The Celtics obviously could right now be down 2-1 in this series, but they have been able to pull away, mainly due to Indiana's kind of ineptitude in the final stages of these games. But looking at the betting trends and also the fantasy projections for tonight's game, tonight we are looking at a 222.5 over-under. Also, Boston is giving Indiana 7.5 points. And the money lines are looking like Indiana plus 245 and Boston minus 300. Looking at fantasy projections, this is from DraftKings. Obviously, the big names to look out for, obviously, because Tyrese Halliburton is injured, we will not be looking at his projections for tonight, but we will be looking at Jason Tatum, a much discussed and controversial figure in both real life and the fantasy world. Tonight he is valued at $10K on DraftKings, and it's projected to have 55 flat DraftKings fantasy points. Like I said before, in terms of Indiana, Tyrese Halliburton, his status is up in the air, so tonight's big player for them, if he should be out, is Pascal Siakam. He is currently priced at 7.5K on the DraftKings market, and he is projected to have 40 fantasy points. That is going to be a huge miss if Tyrese Halliburton does not play, but I highly expect Pascal Siakam due to the fact that Boston does not have that much depth outside of the injured Kristaps Porzingis down low. They have tried to combat that with whether it be Luke Cornett or O'Shea Brissett down low, but ultimately Pascal Siakam has looks to be one of Indiana's most promising players in this series, both offensively and defensively. Another quick shout out in terms of fantasy, after his surprisingly huge game last game in Game 3, Al Horford last game, obviously without his offensive production, perhaps the Celtics would not have been in the position they were in down late in that game. Tonight he is valued at 5.8K, so if you're looking for a very cheap option to roster on your DraftKings daily fantasy basketball lineup, he is one to look out for. He is currently projected to have 30.8 DraftKings fantasy points, so not bad for someone who was not expected to get as many looks in this series as he did. But overall, I think that Al Horford does add that offensive presence, at the very least for the Celtics, like he proved in Game 3 of this series. So I think that he could be a sneaky fantasy prospect for tonight's game. So do look out for him. And last but not least, in terms of fantasy, another guy who impressed in the absence of the Pacers' biggest star, Andrew Nembhard. Last game, he had a very impressive game, kept the pace for this Pacers offense. Tonight he is projected to go for 5.7K on the DraftKings market, and is last but not least projected to have 28.5 DraftKings fantasy points. So as you can see, high variations and shifts in terms of both betting trends and fantasy projections for tonight's game, due to the fact that even though the Celtics have a big 3-0 lead, this series has not been as expected in terms of how close all of these games have been, especially last game when a Tyrese Halliburton was injured. So I do believe that in order for the Pacers to keep pace, I do think that ultimately you have to rely on a guy like Andrew Nembhard to keep the pace for the squad. Also, looking at Pascal Siakam down low, that is the one advantage that I do think the Pacers have. They have that depth down low to combat anything that Boston throws at them, whether it be Siakam or Turner. They just have that extra oomph that is lacking right now in the Boston Celtics depth chart because of the injury to Porzingis. As for Porzingis' status for tonight's game, he was, in the words of Woj, expected to be in this lineup for tonight's game at the very least, but in my honest opinion, I do think that Porzingis should be held out, as it is looking more and more like Boston should be able to handle the Pacers in this final game of this series. I do expect Boston to win. Ultimately, I think that that game 2 nights ago was a fluke. I think that because the fact that Boston was able to come back in such a fashion, I do think that Indiana is going to come out deflated tonight, thinking that obviously they could have at least stolen a game and prevented the Celtics from going for a sweep, but that is not the case tonight. I think that the Celtics will complete the sweep in good old-fashioned dominance, that's showing that they do belong in the NBA Finals. But ultimately, I think that this series was a very entertaining series, both in terms of how to play this, in terms of betting odds, and also in how you could roster a potential lineup for this squad. So looking ahead at the betting odds for tonight's game, I think that -7.5 for Boston is a nice round number for them. I think that ultimately they will cover this number. I think that this game should be easier than last game. I think that Boston is hungry. They're looking to close out this series, finally get a much desired sweep, and look ahead to the NBA Finals where they can plan to have a healthy Kristaps Porzingis back. I also believe that in terms of the over-under for tonight's game, I think that it's going to hit the under. I do not think that Indiana's offense is going to be able to keep up with Boston in the slightest tonight because of the fact that they're missing Tyrese Halliburton. I do expect Andrew Nembhard to have a huge game. I do expect Pascal Siakam to have a huge game. However, I do not think their efforts will be realized, as I just do not think they have enough around them to mitigate for the loss of Tyrese Halliburton. So therefore, I'm going to take the under in this game, and I do advise that you do the same. In terms of the money line, I do think that Boston money line is a bit high, also in terms of Indiana's money line. So I will stay away from the money lines tonight. I do think that overall this game is just going to be a straightforward game. I think that Boston is going to handle them comfortably, hence the under in terms of the spread there. But overall, looking at fantasy, I do think that there are some huge opportunities for big points. I'm looking at Jason Tatum tonight to be the huge fantasy point getter again. He has had a very good series this series. Last series, he was the only player to post a stat line like he did without any turnovers. So that is huge, both in real life and in terms of fantasy. And I think that he will be the player to get the Celtics going tonight. But I'm also looking at Al Horford. I think that the last game was a huge surprise for not only him, but for the Celtics as a whole. I think that his 7 3-pointers last game did help them in that comeback. So obviously, right now, he is going to be the most important player, both offensively and defensively, for the Celtics. Can he keep up with the Pacers bigs in this game? That's the big question. Obviously, we know that at any given time, his shot in the corner will always be open because the Pacers are going to be so focused on both Tatum and Brown. So I'm looking for a high volume of three-pointers from Ageless Al tonight because of the fact that Indiana's going to be trying so hard to keep up with Tatum and Brown tonight. Another player that's going to benefit from that is Jrue Holiday, perhaps. Obviously, last game he had the big steal, a couple of steals in that game, but the big steal coming at the end of the game. I think that Jrue Holiday has just been a huge impact player for the Celtics. In terms of fantasy, he's not someone who you would expect to put up huge points in fantasy, but he is always a reliable option, whether it be on your bench or as a utility option. I just think that overall, the Celtics players tonight will benefit in terms of fantasy rather than Indiana's, just because of the loss of Tyrese Halliburton and how he can affect that Indiana squad. But honestly, I do think that we have to be wary about that statement because of the fact that Nembhard did deliver for them last game. And I think that Siakam is going to benefit as well. I think that Turner as well. I'm also looking at TJ McConnell. He's a huge contributor in these games, whether it be distributing the ball, getting points on his own. So do look out for a lot of Indiana players on the market who I expect to, whether or not they get blown out, put up good numbers in terms of fantasy. But honestly, I'm looking at Boston's players to benefit in terms of fantasy as well. That's going to do it for this segment. But coming up in our next segment, we are going to move over to the NHL, to the ice, to talk about the Edmonton Oilers and the Dallas Stars Game 3 tonight.